we have a tradition of giving the golden thumb, which is cast in Roger's thumb. Yes.
Thank you. Roger was very kind and generous to this film. It made a big difference. And throughout his career, Roger was very supportive. And that made a huge difference because sometimes these kind of movies really, there was a lot of opposition too. But Roger made a huge difference, and thank you for having me. I'm very proud of this, and I'm going to put it somewhere in my house where I can see it when I feel the most depressed.
And we're going to call out Matt Zoller-Seitz so he can do a Q&A with you right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming out to this movie. It's really fantastic to see it look so good and sound so good and play so well. A powerful movie, maybe a classic. I would say it's safe to say that 25 years down the road. I guess the first question I want to ask is, when did you first read Born on the 4th of July? Which is, of course, the memoir. This is based on a true story, Ron Kovic's book, published in 1976, about his experience.
The book came out, I believe, in 75?
Yeah, well, this maybe the paperback is 76, but that's what it says.
75 or
yeah.
6, and
Yeah.
it was well received. It was on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. Got a lot of attention. It was only a year after the Vietnam War had ended. My attention was brought to it. I was avoiding material like that, frankly, and my attention was brought to it by the producer, Martin Bregman, who had optioned my screenplay, Platoon, and he thought I'd be perfect to write this. But I didn't, for Al Pacino. This was 1977 and 8.
So there was a previous incarnation of this, not just the one that we saw.
Oh, totally. There was a 10 years. It's ironic in my life that Platoon was written in 76 and Born on the 4th screenplay was completed in 78, 9 and done. Both films were done exactly 10 years after the screenplay was written, and both films were supervised by directors. I was a writer, screenplay writer, working for those directors, Billy Friedkin and Dan Petrie, and in the case of Platoon, the supposed original director was Sidney Lumet, who I had met in 76. But I wrote for Friedkin, and as you pointed out earlier, the book is a very poetic, structured, fragmented story through time, back and forth, and it ends, as you said, I forgot how it ended.
It does. In fact, it ends with, this is a very linear story, although thinking about it this time, it begins with a voiceover, and then at the end of the story, we can get into this a little bit, but he goes off to give the speech at the 1976 Democratic Convention, and there's a moment that almost looks like his life is flashing before his eyes. And we've talked about this a little bit. I'm almost about to drive Oliver completely nuts with my love for this movie, because every time I talk to him, I have to talk about Born on the 4th of July. But it seems to me that this is, as I was talking about it with Chaz backstage, one of the things I love about this movie, besides the emotional power of it, is the rhetorical beauty of the statement that it makes and how it makes that statement. And it very much seems to me like the movie A Clockwork Orange in reverse. It's about a guy who realizes that he's been programmed and systematically deprograms himself over the course of the movie. And he's not the same guy at the end. He's not. It's about him realizing what he's made of, and that the person he thought he was, he didn't have any choice in it.
Although I think Clockwork Orange is a very cool, hip movie by Kubrick, and one of his best, but I think of this when I see it just now, I thought of it more as wow, Oliver, that's as close as you'll ever come to a Frank Capra. And
True.
I have to say, you reminded me today that the book ends with him being wounded, which is shown at the 40% mark in the movie. And I was thinking of what Friedkin said at the time. He had done French Connection and Exorcist, and he was one of the hottest directors, and he said, he said had been an earlier screenplay by another writer, which was all over the place in terms of structure, trying to mimic the book. And he said, forget this nonsense. This is, Billy's from Chicago. He said, this is good corn. He said, keep it that way. Make it straight through. Write it straight through. And you'll see the power that it'll pick up. And frankly, I adhered to that and did it that way. And it's the way then the film was canceled. I mean, it was a heartbreaker with Al. We rehearsed the whole movie. Dan Petrie had taken over because Billy had moved on. And the financing fell apart, but I saw the entire rehearsal with Pacino, which is an amazing experience because Al is such a great actor, but he was 37, 38 years old or something like that at that time. He was frankly, he was too old for it, but he was such a marvelous actor that it was great I learned a lot, made improvements, etc. And the whole thing was cast, 2 weeks of rehearsal, I think 2 weeks to go, and the money fell apart. The studio, Universal, was not overly upset. They did not really, we're not looking forward to making this movie. Coming Home had come out, I believe, already.
Yeah, 78.
And had not made any money. So and Coming Home was partially based on this. I mean, partially, because they had interviewed Ron.
This was, just to give everybody some context for this, for the younger members of the audience, Vietnam did not begin to be dealt with in American cinema really until the mid to late 70s, and there was a wave of movies in 78, Coming Home, Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, and so forth, Go Tell the Spartans, that began to deal with with the war directly rather than in terms of metaphor. And there may have been a sense, I guess, that maybe we're doing too many Vietnam movies, let's not have another one.
Oh yeah, no, it was such a collapse, and the scene at the end with Charlie, I was thinking about it just as you've seen. You know, Ron was so upset because we had worked on it so hard together to make this. We wanted to kill Al. You know,
were you physically writing the script with him, like you were in the?
Well, there's so much time. I write alone, but I spent a lot of time with Ron in hotel rooms talking. He was so excited about Al Pacino, who was a big star. You know, it was heartbreaking to see this fall apart. It was depressing. And we had a scene in Venice Beach where he was chasing me down the beach like Charlie, Willem Dafoe does. I mean, he wanted to kill me because you understand the rage was so, why couldn't we do this movie? And I said to him, he quotes this story. I said, Ron, I swear to you, if I ever make it in this Hollywood, I will come back and make this movie.
That's what you told him.
I swear. Yeah, and he said he remembered that because life takes its very strange winds blow. Platoon gets made in '86, 10 years later. I thought it was way dead, and of course it was an international success. And that set the tone for this film. That was able to be done. This and Tom Cruise signing on, who was at that time certainly the biggest young star in Hollywood, and it still was Universal was tough with the budget. I mean, it was a struggle throughout. It wasn't easy at all in terms of, we did go over budget. And frankly, we reshot the ending, the Democratic convention. We reshot that. So all this cost another $2-3 million at the time. It was quite a struggle, even with Cruise, by the way, who was a bona fide star. So, wow, I mean, 10 years, exactly. It fell apart in '79, and it was made in '89. So 10 years. It's a strange story. And
Tom Cruise at the time was, still is one of the biggest stars in the world, but he was certainly the youngest big star in the world aside from Eddie Murphy. And his biggest movie up to that point had been Top Gun. And I got such an enormous kick out of seeing him cast in this part because it was almost as if you had taken Uncle Sam and just thrown him down and just said, get out of here. I mean, there was something so iconically powerful about Maverick from Top Gun in this part.
Oh, Top Gun was, you know, those of you who are too young, you have to see this movie. It would still be popular if they make it today, and they probably would remake it.
They're making a sequel.
No.
Yeah, they are.
Okay, but you know how Top Gun ends. It's an amazingly well done movie. Tony Scott did. It's one of his best technically moved. But the movie ends basically with the U.S. Young guys, Mavericks, going to World War III with the Russians and exulting about it. It's just exactly the opposite message. It's the young Tom Cruise. It's the young Ron Kovic in this movie. That's the ending of Top Gun, and it made far more money than Born on the 4th of July. I mean, it cleaned up. cleaned up at the box office. Big.
It was I think one of the biggest movies of that year.
It's $180 million domestic, I think, 60. We made 75, and we were lucky, as I said earlier, that we opened it that horrible weekend when we invaded Panama. So, listen, this movie, when I see all the rage on the screen, I'm kind of shocked because it's still there. It's naked, raw anger, and it comes mostly from Ron, because I had made my peace with the war, I thought. It was Ron who activated my anger, and I mean, I was living through Ron at this point. I was not doing my own story, but there are some things of my own personal return in this movie. But still, it's so angry. It shocks me, and it doesn't let up. But you have to understand, this guy's living in hell, and sitting in the back there, I just felt like, God, this fucking movie doesn't end. This is hell. This is fucking hell. I just cannot be here anymore. I mean, young people rejected the film. We did not do the business of Platoon, partly because young people, young women especially, would be depressed. And the young man, Tom Cruise, is castrated in the movie. This is not easy at that time.
I imagine the young guys weren't too thrilled about it either.
No, and it did not become a date movie, I have to tell you, which. So we lost out it's a tough movie. However, it does have a quality, and people stuck with it, and it did very well overseas, and in fact is one of the highest grossing movies I've ever been involved with, and it continues to do well. So, it did. I hope it lasts, but I don't know that the country learned anything from it, frankly. I really cannot say that. In full honesty, I feel very frustrated and depressed, as you know from my untold history of the United States, that this system is in place, and this patriotism remains to this day. There was a recent poll done by Gallup, believe it or not. My colleague on Untold History told me this story. 51% of the 16 to 28-year-olds in this country, 51% believe the Vietnam War was a good war.
Well, that's a natural segue to. I was looking through. I love to go back and read old reviews of movies that came out at the time, and there was a wonderful line in Pauline Kael's review of Top Gun, which she wasn't particularly fond of. She said, "This is I believe it was something along the lines of, this is a recruiting poster that is not concerned with recruiting, but with being a poster." And I thought about that again watching this film tonight, because this movie is very much a critical look at the recruiting poster mentality. I mean, everything in this film from the very beginning is about conditioning people to go to war. And there's a scene in JFK, the famous scene on the park bench with Jim Garrison and Mr. X, is that his name? And he says, the organizing principle of every society, Mr. Garrison, is for war. And you think about that when Tom Berenger comes to talk to high school kids, and he talks about the Iwo Jima and the frozen chosen reservoir and everything about it, the 4th of July parades, the fireworks, the cheerleader tossing her baton in the air, and it looks like the ape throwing its bone into the air in 2001. I mean, there's some very symbolically deep stuff going on in this movie.
The people that I know, veterans, I mean, they're divided. We're divided, but many of them were really depressed during that 2002 to 2008 period. I know I was. It was the worst time to live through this again, and not having learned was infinitely depressing. However, I have to say that, in all honesty, the mentality in the country for the last month since the Ukraine Crimea thing happened has been a return to the same exact mentality, the groupthink that says, okay, let's get ready for Russia. I mean, that's why maybe Top Gun 2 will probably make a fortune. They may have a scene, of course, where the Russians are still there as our enemy, where, in fact, if you examine this thing in more detail, it's much more complex and deserves debate and instead of groupthink. So I'm not, in fact, yesterday I was at University of Wisconsin for the last 2 nights talking to students. And, it's very clear from talking to the professors. Alfred McCoy was our host, wonderful professor of history, wonderful. He said to me that in his classes and his fellow teachers, this new generation, those of you who were born in the 1990s, Vietnam is basically under the bridge. It's forgotten, much like World War I would have been to us, and World War II to perhaps the Iraq generation. So Vietnam has become the war before the last war. So think about that in terms of, remember 1984, there was always a war, and the enemy kept shifting back and forth to the same enemy, but knew Eurasia and
Right.
East
We
Asia.
we were never at war with Eurasia. One of the lines from it. Yeah. The way that you portray this conditioning and how he eventually comes to see through it. Can you talk a little bit about the look of the film and the feel of the film? I mean, there's almost a Life magazine sort of feeling to it, the textures, the colors, and all of these patriotic symbols, this kind of apple pie laced with arsenic that you've got going on in the movie.
No, it was a very deliberate choices. The production team, Bob Richardson, director of photography, Bruno Rubeo, production designer. We tried to, we knew this was our most epic film to date. Now, this was done in anamorphic. This was our first film in anamorphic. It was the first one. And to fill that screen, you have to spend money. So obviously the producers were saying, what do we have to do? You realize, all you do 2, 3, 5, you're going to have more props. Everything's got to be period, and it's going to cost X amount and more. So I said, yeah, but it's worth it. So Bob laid out this Life magazine, the 3 color stripes that they used to do. He wanted to get that look as much as possible. And if you notice the early part of the film, which is optimistic and certainly patriotic, the first parade is very much based on Life magazine photos from the 50s and 60s. Beautiful colors, by the way. And of course, in Vietnam, we did another look. We didn't do the platoon look. We did a very beached, dirty, hazy, hot hell look, and yellow.
That's in the book too, though. And if anybody's curious, it happened to him he describes the dunes.
Yeah, that's where he was stationed, near the first corps, near the rivers, Dong Ha, all those areas, Qua Viet, wherever the Marines were working the beaches, a lot of the beach areas, and inland too. I was up there on my second part of my tour in the 1st Cavalry. We replaced the Marines up in the north at the 1st Camp Evans, but it was that dirty, hazy look, very dangerous in its own way, different from jungle. But Ron was the 3rd part of the film is, of course, that horrible hospital which was hell to shoot, and that is actually based. I mean, Ron was writing about this at the Bronx VA and criticizing it, and I think it did lead to some reforms in the VA system. I do believe it helped, although that remains a... And now Ron swears by the Long Beach VA. He says it's a good VA, so I don't want to just launch complete negative criticism, because I think a lot of good people work at the VA, but this was a hellhole. There's no question about it.
There's a great sadness in that sequence, and it's not just because of the pain that Ron is going through, but also the people who work in the hospital are understaffed, overworked, at wit's end. Some of them are very cynical and seem to have given up, and other people are so depressed at the fact that they can't do more for these veterans.
No, Ron was honest. You know, Ron was not calling it. He was telling me about these characters, and sometimes Ron had a great memory, and sometimes he'd remember exact dialogues, which helped me a lot, to get those crazy expressions that people say sometimes. And then, of course, the Massapequa sequence, to me, is the return, and that second parade sums it up. The second parade being the opposite of the 50s parade. It's a 70s up and away parade with washed out colors reminds me much of the early 70s films, which were frankly horrible looking, but very realistic, but really dirty, washed out colors. And
there's a shot of the American flag, and it's transparent, and you can see through it.
Yeah.
In that.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of flags used ironically, and there's a sense in which you're almost it's like you're reclaiming patriotism from the right in this movie. I mean, this is a movie that looks like, if you're watching it with the sound off, just the first half of it, you might think that it was Top Gun in the 50s. It's got that kind of look to it. It's very sunny and very optimistic, but then it turns darker and darker and darker as it goes along.
What I like about the early scenes is the awkwardness of the young man. I mean, he is so shy with women. I think people forget, they think teenage movies, it's always like a little bit more. But I love the fact that he's so awkward, and that was Ron in the book. He was a virgin, and he just never. I don't know how far it went in the book was there a Donna character? I forgot exactly. But,
not by that name.
But it was difficult for him to relate to women. Partly, and he had a strong mother, a wonderfully fucking tough mother, and a father who was somewhat passive. And I also liked him very much. But these events more or less happened in the sense that he did have to leave the house to go to Mexico. And in Mexico, we have a false paradise. We create a false paradise. And I think the film gets juiced in that last 3/4 of an hour by Willem Dafoe's entry. You need that kind of push in a movie sometimes. Willem brings this new energy to it, and I think it powers it. And of course, Georgia never happened. The Georgia sequences was much contested, and I was criticized for it. But you know, in the book, it was very clear, if you pay close attention, that the Wilson affair, shooting the Wilson soldier, young Wilson, affected Ron deeply because he's a Catholic, and he never could recover from a sense of guilt, and he had to confess. He had to confess. He tried to do it with a Marine officer. What you were saying?
Well, I was going to say, in fact, I was rereading the book in preparation for this, and there are a number of scenes in the movie, major scenes that are not in the book, and yet they kind of are in the book. And one example is the scene where he goes to confess to the soldier's family. There's no scene where that actually happens, but the entire book is a confession. And essentially, he's telling the readers what happened to him and what he did, and there are sections of his description that become dialogue in that scene.
That is exactly why we did it, and I made that choice, but I was much criticized for it because the whole book is written in that, and my point was that it was a confession. It's a public confession in his book. He's saying he never looked up the family. He never found them. Don't ask me why. It's a hard thing to do. Maybe it wasn't available. Maybe the information was not available, but he did. The whole thing, the book is pitched as a confession, and it's naked, and it has to be done. Without that scene, I don't think I would have, I don't know where, it was already a tough ending, you know, to make this cross as we jumped through the years, because it was already 2 hours and 20 minutes, so, you know.
It's a 210-page book, and it's not until the last 5 pages that he talks about the massacre and the shooting. The accidentally shooting a fellow soldier. He takes the entire book building up the nerve to tell you what happened.
Exactly, it's a good point. It takes him the whole book to tell us that. But I don't know if that would have worked as a movie. You can disagree with me. You know, Johnny Got His Gun was his model. Dalton Trumbo's wonderful book. He was always loved, and he was moved because of Trumbo's book to write this book, I think. And All Quiet on the Western Front too was a major influence for him. But no, the movie, I think Friedkin said the right thing. It was good corn. Do a Capra film with heart, but go straight through. Don't get fancy with it.
And I want to ask you one more.
As you know, in a lot of other films later in my career, I did get, you know,
yeah.
time structure changed.
It does. Well, and this is a very straightforward movie, and even the way that it's shot is very straightforward. It's very concentrated, and there are a lot of scenes where you're just sitting there watching people behave. And it's a very focused film. I wanted to ask you one more thing before we open up the floor to audience questions, which is you mentioned earlier when you were working on adapting Ron Kovic's book with Ron that a lot of it was him recalling his past, kind of adding additional details, but there were some details that come from your experience. And I wondered if you could give me an example of what some of those might be.
You're talking 25 years ago, more than that. You're talking 35 years ago. It's a tough one. I mean, I'm in there in some ways, but I had done Platoon, and I was supposed to do a movie called Second Life, which I had written about his return from Vietnam, but I thought that because I went back to a relatively privileged New York family, that I was not in touch with the actual pulse of the country, which was more, because Ron came from the heartland, the Massapequas that put up most of the boys in this war, the small towns, and I thought it would be more honest and accurate, and I thought Ron had a greater story than my story, so I went with his story, which is, you know, delayed gratification for me, but on the other hand, I really was happy with doing that, and to this, you wanted me to write some other thing about Vietnam, you asked me to do when I came back, and because that's another story, but that's another completely
That was the
another
story he's referring to. I interviewed him for New York Magazine about his experience coming back from the war and enrolling in NYU Film School, where his teacher was Martin Scorsese. And that whole period, and in fact,
That's where the door starts.
My next book about a director is a book about Oliver Stone. So we've been talking for about a year for that book, and he told me some stories about that. But that was why I said, that sounds like a movie to me, the story of your coming home and becoming an artist.
I don't think the younger people don't care about that time period.
I think they might. Anyway,
all those crazy costumes and the long hair, the sideburns, and the
Mad Men.
The horrible clothes, some of those horrible clothes, those bell trousers. Does anyone like those still? What do young people think of the clothing?
Somebody wants to know. Let's start the questions.
American
Okay.
Hustle.
Somebody wants to know, what do you think of American Hustle?
She said the clothes.
Clothes. Okay. All right. Let's wait till we have a microphone. Anybody over here. Yeah.
I think this film is absolutely extraordinary, and I think it's the best performance of Tom Cruise's career. That's what I think. I was reminded of my cousin Jeremy Scahill, who recently risked his life making the documentary Dirty Wars and became a target of a great deal of controversy in the process and got death threats and things like that. So I'm just wondering how you've been able to approach controversial topics throughout your career, how you've been able to deal with controversy and, you know, really just be able to maintain a fearlessness in tackling contentious issues.
By not looking back too much and not thinking about it too much, because you realize this period was very fast. Right from Born on 4th of July, '89, I'm making talk radio. No, before it, I'm making 2 films practically a year. 1 film every year comes out for 10 years. So I'm rushing. And it is scary. But Born on the 4th created polarization a lot. But by the time it was out there and I was already working on Doors, I was in for another ride. And then I was going right from Doors to JFK, and that was the biggest roller coaster I'd ever been on up until that point. And that one was crazy. By early '92, I was gone from war hero to national traitor, a bit like Ron. I mean, it was really for me stepping out into a public eye, defending the JFK investigation as a public figure, and instead of just being a movie maker and saying, look, it's, you like it or not, walk away from it. I defended the movie, and I went to a form of, you know, really like Ron. I had to become a public spokesman in a way. New profile for me, changed my life. And then, of course, Natural Born Killers, within 2 years after that, I was in the hot water. I mean, from that, I just never recovered from that period. So how do you deal with it? You don't. You just go on. You put up with it, and you fight the best you can, and you defend your honor, because I am responsible for the movies. I'm not shirking them. I'm not saying it's just a movie. But it's very hard, because you pay a price, as you know, with the critics, too. The critics, they prejudge some of the movies you make without even bothering at that point. They cut you off. So the career begins to change after Nixon and goes a little bit slower. And sometimes I do think too much about that stuff. And I have to get away from that, because you lose confidence. You think about, you know, imagine the confidence you require to make these movies one after the other without, when you're getting veterans very upset. All the officer corps, the Marine Corps, very upset with Kovic. They deny the story. They say Kovic is full of shit, that killing never happened, that it was never reported. It's not in the official papers. Apparently the major or whatever he was never put it into, never reported it, which is another one of these millions of documents that disappear in Vietnam, if in fact it was ever recorded. So Kovic's story is denied by the Marines. The VA hospitals criticized him, and you know, as the guy in the bar said, you know, you're a whiner, you know, you're a loser, don't be a whiner. You signed up, they didn't sign you up. So there is, you know, there's a lot of anger, and it's in our country. We still see this argument is going on to this day. I mean, it's just recently some of the statements made in the Ukraine situation. The U.S. supposedly is weak and soft, and Obama is not reacting. All this comes from that old you have to fight back, you have to be tough, you have to be macho.
John Wayne.
Well, yeah, the wrestling scene in the movie, all of Ron's childhood is like my childhood. It's so competitive, so male-driven. So you have to be a winner. You have to be number one. The mother too. You have to be number one, and you can't be number two in life. Such a crazy philosophy, you know. It cuts us off and leads to perilous failure.
Directly in front of you.
You kind of touched on what I wanted to ask about, is that there's a lot of veterans in my life. I have therapy dogs and work with veterans, and no matter how many letters I write and how many times I vote, you know, policy doesn't seem to change. And I was wondering, through your work in film and with Untold History, how you think your work could influence policy.
Wrote something for Movie Maker magazine. I said Maximilian Schell died recently. He was 83 years old, and he said, of all the films I've done, all the films I've seen, praising the glory of man and the efforts made by man to make better social equality in the world, that none of them have succeeded. And he felt very frustrated. And I do think you have to resign yourself to the fact that power belongs to those who seek it, those who go to the public office and they fight like dogs and cats, and they get the power, and they have power is the most aggrandizing feeling, emotion. It's, as Kissinger said, a total aphrodisiac. And power, there's nothing to contradict it. No artist, no social creature in the United States can stand up to that power. Even Martin Luther King, as great a man as he was, could not stand up to that system, especially in the last 3 years of his life. And no one has succeeded. No one has led us out of the wilderness in a long time. Hopefully, you know, all we do is we throw a little pebble in the water, and you hope there's resonance. And you know, a younger generation might get lucky. Remember, there is hope. There was a guy in the Soviet Union in 1980s who emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was a product of the system. Nobody knew he was going to do that. Our CIA missed the boat completely. And Gorbachev spun this whole new version of the Soviet Union and changed the system entirely, and the world for the better. It could have been better if we had gone along with the deal. So change is possible. I do believe there's a difference between a Gore and a Bush. I mean, I do believe Gore would have made a huge difference to 2001. And I think Obama was a huge amount of hope and change, but it didn't happen that way. So do we give up, or do we, you know, we have to keep trying? And if I can raise my voice here and there and make a little statement, but I'd have, when you talk to Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and you see the structure of power in this country, you know, they don't take us seriously. We don't have that tradition of respecting what the artists and dramatists have to say. The historians come first.
We have a question in the lower balcony, a bit to the right.
Mr. Stone, I would like to say that I saw your film when it came out, and I found it far more powerful today. That's just a comment. My question is, what has happened with Ron Kovic, his life beyond the Democratic National Convention?
Ron basically is healthy as an ox. I've seen him recently, and he is strong. And you have to, you know what he goes through every day. Imagine, he lives in, he moved to the Redondo Beach, and he's been living there for years. He has a steady relationship with a wonderful woman. He goes and speaks when he can. He's protested all the Iraq War up and down. He went to everything he could during that period. He's been more quiet recently. He vows to return with another book, but he's been saying that for a long time. And he's been writing this book for a long time, so I don't know what the status of that is. But he's healthy still, and I'm amazed. He's one of the strongest men I've ever met in my life, to be able to go through what he does every day.
Your next question comes from the floor, straight in front of you.
40+ years ago, I was in the Air Force, and the draft ended, and I thought it was the best thing that could ever happen. Today, we've had a 13-year-plus war in Afghanistan, and we see none of the protests. Nobody seems to care because less than 2% or 1% of the population is affected, either service people or their families. Is there anything we can do about that, short of bringing back a draft or universal service?
I believe in universal service. Yeah, I do. I mean, if you don't want to go to the military, I believe that you should give 2 to 3 years to your country. I do. And it's a shame we don't have a system that works, a collective system. But you have to realize that since the Reagan Revolution in 1980, the government, not the government, the Republican Party and the neoconservative branch have made a concerted effort to change the memory of our country. Reagan has denied the war. He said that the Vietnam War was a noble thing. We were fighting for the freedom and the freedom of the Vietnamese people. This was echoed by every single president since then, the 2 Bushes, and by Clinton, and unfortunately, recently by Obama, who's commemorating the 13-year anniversary of the war. And he said things very positive about the role the Americans have played, that given us that concept of specialness, what do we call exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, that we are somehow different than the rest of history, that we do things unselfishly. hard to believe that, considering the resources at stake in the Middle East and the concepts of aggression that we've grown up with. We just assumed them. We saw them in the film. The memory of, and now the newspapers are beating the same war drum. I've seen it all my life. Remember all the covers leading to Vietnam, all the covers leading to Kuwait, by the way, Grenada, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now perhaps, this. I don't think we'll stop until we dominate the world completely. I think that is the ultimate goal of the neoconservatives, but that's become bipartisan foreign policy since 1980. Everything that the neocons said in 1998 in their position paper, Project for the New American Century, we will not allow the emergence of any economic or political or military rival. They said that very clearly. And that was a game plan, and it's been in effect essentially since 2001. And we have gone after those 7 countries in the Middle East we said we would, and there is an agenda here. And I don't believe we will allow the Russians to breathe. As long as we don't have it, they still have the nuclear power that we have, much less so, but we're much more precise. But we are still not content. And this is a very dangerous time because they are the only power that can fight us on this level. And they will fight us for their own borders, for their own geopolitical interests. So, don't hold your breath. Hold your breath right now. This is a very precarious era. And unfortunately, our rhetoric has not changed. That's what's scary. Nothing has been learned. I am very angry, very frustrated, and I wish I could do something. Just keep electing some people who think. Here in this state, you have a good tradition, been with good people. I come from, I think so, Wisconsin. You've had some good senators, good congressmen. I hope, don't lose the ability to vote and stay. If we can take to the streets, that's tough too. If we can take to the streets, that would be great when it counts. They did in Wisconsin, by the way. Not too long ago, 150,000 people walked down the streets of Madison in a labor revolt against the Governor Walker's policies. 150,000. There's never been a labor protest so big in the history of the United States.
Yeah, Oliver was just in Wisconsin yesterday. We were talking about that today, and I asked you if you thought that there was any hope for meaningful change of the system, specifically the influence that money has in the volume of people's voices and corporations' voices, and how do you feel about that?
How do I feel? You know how I feel. Everyone feels the same way.
Well, but they haven't heard it.
We are slaves. We're feudal serfs in a corporate system that's taken over. This was warned against in the early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt, the trust busters, the concept of corporations owning property and being having human rights is very difficult for me to accept. And they do not have it. The corporations are businesses disguised to assume rights over humans. And we work for these corporations in increasing numbers, and we have very little say anymore, as if we ever did. The country was always rough on labor, but it's rough now. And the minimum wage is still, we're arguing about a minimum wage that should have been raised to $15 about over the last 20, 30 years. It's just, I don't know, it's so backward, and that's a country in decline. We haven't changed with the times. So it is scary, and we're going to live through. But as a dramatist, I'm kind of interested in sticking around and see what happens, because that's what a dramatist does. What happens next, right? It's kind of interesting time, but a dark one, a perilous one. But don't give up.
We have a question.
The curve of the ball, history shows us that the curve of the ball can break differently, is a line we used in chapter 10 of our history. Very important to realize that the Gorbachevs, the John Kennedys, the Roosevelts, they do come along, and sometimes they get through. In Wisconsin, there's a lesbian senator, I think Tammy Baldwin, who's actually done a very remarkable job for the last 10 years. Who's Tammy Baldwin? She was a unfavored, low odds candidate. She won this election against white men in a very tough state, which a lot of rednecks in Wisconsin. And it's a state that's breeded Joe McCarthy, at the same time Bob La Follette. So you have extremes in Wisconsin, but you see that it's still there is this progressive strain in people, and it comes out. But these are narrow elections. They're squeaky elections, but they make a difference if we vote.
We have a question for you, slightly to your left, midway up the aisle. Over here.
Can I get some water from backstage? Thank you.
Thank you for bringing so many important issues to the public through film. It does have a huge effect. And I'd like to know maybe 5 or 6 other topics that you think could be effectively dealt with through films such as the ones you make. And which of those are you going to make?
I don't think I'm going to make that many more movies. This Untold History was 12 hours and 5 years of my life, and it was very tough to get that out. We got it out, luckily, just by the skin of its teeth with a cable television. So, but it does sum up everything I've tried to do and more, I think.
I assume most of you, if you're here for a screening of Born on the 4th of July, you know what he's talking about. But The Untold History of the United States, which aired on Showtime last year, is another major work by Oliver Stone, and it's also in some ways, I think, the key to a lot of the movies that he's made over his career. And if you have seen any part of it, you know that it doesn't feel like any other documentary. It's pure montage with Oliver Stone talking to you. And it's a little bit like having Oliver Stone actually in your head. I don't know if that's a recommendation or not. It depends on who you are. I found it interesting.
Hey, listen, the DVD, 14 hours is for $18, so don't complain. You can get it on Amazon. So, and because we figured they wouldn't believe what we were doing, we wrote a book of 800 pages, which is also available and doing very well in paperback. So it is out there, and it's all over the world except for, I'm working on China now and Russia, but it is out there. So. As to the topics, oh man, the list is long. Money in politics would be a great Capra subject. He's done it before. You know, money in politics, if we could make, but you know, how do we get them out of there? How do we get money out? Nobody, the Supreme Court just fucked us again. And again, they go down in history. United, 2000 election, what kind of Supreme Court is this? I think a good movie about the Supreme Court where you spear these guys. Really, I worked on one. I mean, the behind the scenes of how they think and how they vote, that'd make an interesting movie.
Oliver Stone's Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's the Supreme Court. And money in politics, what else? Labor, where'd labor go? What else? What do you think would make a good subject?
I don't know. I'm still hoping that you're gonna do another financial thriller about the crash.
No.
I know that Wall Street 2 was sort of roundabout about that, but let's talk about something that sparked public anger.
Snowden, eavesdropping, suspicionless surveillance, 1984. These are good subjects.
I think we can take one more.
To the right, in the lower balcony again.
Hi, Oliver Stone. I'm just thrilled to be here with you. I mean, you're just an amazing person. I think that, you were going to do that Martin Luther King movie, but apparently you wanted to tell the truth, but they didn't want you to tell the truth. From what I understand, I don't know exactly, but in actuality, I wish that you would come out with an Oliver Stone film about Oliver Stone, because I really enjoy you. And I really enjoyed seeing you with Jesse Ventura. And I think that this war on drugs has been a big failure for the United States. I know a gentleman named Roger Christie who he was a minister in Hawaii. And he's been in prison for 10 years for using marijuana in his church. And he was using it under the religious beliefs of using cannabis. And I just think that, you're a very strong person. And I really feel good about your freedom of speech, that I feel as though that our freedom of speech is always under attack. And then you have the Koch brothers who are trying to run the government. And then also you have people. I literally met a...
I'm kind of hoping actually there would be a question mark at the end of this.
I would like to have an Oliver Stone movie about Oliver Stone, so I wish that you would come out with an Oliver Stone movie about Oliver Stone.
That's very, very kind of you, and maybe, you know, maybe it's time I confess. I do my Ron Kovic. Yeah, I hope you read what I gave you. But, you know, it's possible. You know, when I can get away with it late in my life, I can run. I'm old enough, maybe I can survive the outpouring of hatred that would come at this movie. That my ego would be, they would say my ego was so massive that I had to make a movie. But I remind you of Truffaut, Fellini, so many great filmmakers made films disguised about themselves. I mean, nobody more overtly than Fellini, and he's one of my greatest influences. So yeah, I'm not ashamed of it, but I am ashamed of it in this country. It's somehow easier if you're European or Asian. It's harder to do it here because of the shit you take, you know. You pay a price, right? Unless you do it in a way that is non-offensive, which was hard to be that way if you're going to take sides and stand up for something.
Well, but then if you could do it that way, but what's the fun in that?
But a good idea, I will take it under, really, I'm seriously, I'm getting there, so I can maybe do it and run. And I don't want to run, I just,
Okay.
you know, go to, I just would like to, maybe to do it, yeah, this is time, you know, enough of the, you know, you can't, at this stage, you don't want to, you have to cut out the bullshit and just get to the point. What?
You could start out with this scene, I guess. All right.
No, I'll start out with a sex scene.
And on that note, let's all go enjoy the rest of our weekend.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.